The Aztec Empire at the height of its power was one of the most powerful empires in Mesoamerica, boasting a population of over 6 million people and controlling the majority of what is now central Mexico. This dominance would all come undone, however, not long after the arrival of the now legendary Hernan Cortez, who, with just 500 Spanish soldiers, managed to conquer one of the most powerful empires of its time. But just how did Cortez and his men manage this impressive feat and irreversibly change Latin American history? Well, those are the questions I'm going to be answering in today's video, so with that little intro out the way, let's get straight into it. The beginnings of what would ultimately become the Spanish conquest of the Aztec Empire can be traced back to 1517 when Cuban governor Diego Velázquez commissioned a fleet of 3 ships under the command of Hernández de Córdoba to sail west and explore the Yucatan Peninsula in modern-day Mexico for the first time. Making their way west, before these first explorers even went ashore, they were already being greeted by the native Mayans at Cape Catoche, who peacefully invited them to land nearby. Now ashore, the Spanish then read the requirement of 1513 to the natives, which was a declaration by the Spanish monarchy declaring the Spaniards' divinely ordained right to take possession of the territories of the New World and to subjugate, exploit, and when necessary fight the native inhabitants, though at the same time offering the natives the protection of the King of Spain if they submitted. Somewhat surprisingly, this first meeting seems to have remained peaceful, even though Cordoba did take 2 prisoners with them to become interpreters as they moved further west, adopting the baptized names of Melchor and Julian. This peace wouldn't be maintained for long, however, as not long after this, on the western side of the peninsula, the Spanish were attacked by the Maya chief Moctezuma in the middle of the night, leaving about 50 Spaniards dead and Cordoba mortally wounded, forcing what remained of the crew to return to Cuba. Just a side note, sorry if I mispronounce any of the names in this video, by the way. I do not speak Spanish or any of these indigenous languages obviously, but I will try my best. It would be about a year after this first expedition that a second one, this time led by Juan de Grijalva, set off and explored both the Yucatan Peninsula and nearby Mexican coastline further, where he soon became the first Spaniard to hear of the great riches of the Aztec Empire and encounter Emperor Moctezuma II's delegation. Upon returning to Cuba, this time mostly intact, it would be the stories of these encounters that further fueled Velázquez's desire to send a third, even larger expedition to the region, this time under the command of his brother-in-law, the soon-to-be immortalized Hernan Cortez. It's worth pointing out that although these men supposedly had a good relationship prior to this point, which was largely the reason Cortez had been appointed to lead the expedition in the first place, as Cortez's departure drew closer, Velázquez became increasingly paranoid and resentful, seemingly realizing that whoever conquered the mainland for Spain would gain fame, glory, and fortune far greater than anything that could be achieved in Cuba. After a lot of political maneuvering and conflict between the two men, which included murders, arrest warrants, and personally lobbying to the King of Spain over the course of the next few months, Cortez, who ultimately came out on top, left Cuba with his expedition consisting of 11 ships carrying about 630 men, including 30 crossbowmen and 12 arquebusiers, an early form of firearm, a doctor, several carpenters, at least 8 women, a few hundred native Arawaks from Cuba, and some Africans, both freedmen and slaves, on the 10th of February 1519, despite the fact Velázquez had actually cancelled the expedition, resulting in Cortez leaving Cuba with the legal status of a mutineer. Regardless of this fact, the conquistadors soon made their way over to the island of Cozumel on the east coast of Yucatan, where the Spaniards spent some time attempting to convert the locals to Christianity, as you do, with mixed results. It would be during this stay that Cortez heard reports of other white men living in the Yucatan and subsequently sent messages to these presumed fellow Spaniards, who turned out to be the survivors of a Spanish shipwreck that had occurred 8 years earlier in 1511, Jeronimo de Aguilar and Gonzalo Guerrero. Upon being reunited with their countrymen for the first time in almost a decade, Aguilar decided to petition his Maya chieftain to be allowed to join his fellow Spaniards, a request which was accepted, allowing him to make his way to Cortez's ships. Now being quite fluent in Maya, as well as some other indigenous languages, Aguilar proved to be an invaluable asset for Cortez as a translator during the following stages of the expedition. In contrast to Aguilar, Guerrero on the other hand decided to stay among the natives, despite Aguilar's best efforts, on the basis that he was by now well assimilated into the Maya culture, having a Maya wife and 3 children, as well as being looked upon as a figure of rank within the Maya state of Chetumal where he lived. Interestingly, it actually appears that Guerrero ended up fighting alongside the Maya against later Spanish incursions, providing military counsel and encouraging resistance, with it being possible he was eventually killed in a later battle against the Spanish. Be that as it may, sometime following Aguilar's joining of the Cortez expedition, the Spaniards continued their journey around the tip of the Yucatan Peninsula, landing at Potonchan, where they were met with a much more hostile reaction than at Cozumel, being confronted by the natives, resulting in 2 battles being fought, in which the defeated Mayas suffered significant casualties and soon after sued for peace. In the following days, the Mayas presented the Spaniards with several peace offerings, including gifts of food and gold, as well as 20 enslaved women, among whom was a woman known as La Malinche, later christened as Marina. This particular indigenous woman's great value was soon uncovered when it was found that she could speak numerous native languages that the expedition's Spanish translator Aguilar could not, including the language of the mysterious Aztec Empire, Nahuatl, while also speaking Mayan. This crucially allowed Cortez to communicate with the Aztecs through a somewhat complicated system in which Cortez would speak to Aguilar in Spanish, who would then translate into Mayan for Marina, who in turn translated that into Nahuatl for the Aztecs. The first opportunity to use these invaluable skills would come not long after Marina's arrival, when in April 1519, Cortez sailed his expedition to the coast of the modern-day state of Veracruz, where they were soon welcomed by representatives of the Aztec Emperor Moctezuma II. In a show of peace, gifts were exchanged between the groups before Cortez, less peacefully, attempted to frighten the Aztecs with a display of his firepower, though how effective this was is unclear. Either way, following this meeting, things remained peaceful between the foreign cultures, with the Spanish soon establishing a settlement named La Villa Rica de la Veracruz, or Rich Town of the True Cross in English, with a possible motive behind this being that Cortez faced imprisonment or death for defying Governor Velasquez, though through a legal mechanism that Velasquez himself had previously used. Cortez was offered the position of adelantado, or Chief Justice and Captain General of the town, which freed him of Velasquez's authority, allowing him to continue his expedition. Free of Velasquez's opposition, at least for now, Cortez soon marched his forces towards a nearby indigenous settlement known as Sempoala, where the Spaniards were greeted by 20 dignitaries and cheering townsfolk. Not long after their arrival in the town, Cortez soon went about the political maneuvering that would characterize their later conquest of the Aztec Empire, quickly persuading the Totonac chiefs to rebel against the Aztecs, before taking prisoner 5 of Moctezuma's tax collectors in the town, with the Totonacs helping Cortez build up his own town of Villa Rica de la Veracruz in return. Unfortunately for Cortez and the Totonacs, it didn't take long for news of this rebellion to reach the Aztec Emperor, who sent ambassadors to Cortez bearing gifts of gold and cloth in thankfulness for Cortez freeing his tax collectors. Moctezuma also supposedly had them deliver the message to Cortez that he was certain the Spanish were of his own race and had arrived as his ancestors had foretold, with Cortez then telling his men that the natives thought of them as gods or godlike beings, although whether or not the natives actually believed that is up for debate, with some recent scholars suggesting that it was simply made up by the Spaniards. Either way, it is believed that these ambassadors, during their meeting with Cortez, also attempted to dissuade him from visiting their capital of Tenochtitlan, but unfortunately for them, their lavish gifts and polite welcoming remarks, in line with their culture, only ended up encouraging Cortez to continue his march towards their great city. Before they could set off further inland, however, men still loyal to the governor of Cuba planned to seize a ship and escape back to Cuba, forcing Cortez to swiftly intervene, hanging 2 of the leaders, lashing another 2, and mutilating the foot of the last. To make sure such a mutiny didn't happen again, Cortez then made the somewhat drastic decision to destroy the rest of his ships, effectively stranding the expedition in what is now central Mexico, and forcing his men to commit to further exploration inland, whether they liked it or not. With the commitment of his men secured one way or another, Cortez then led his expedition inland towards the ever-impressive Aztec capital, accompanied by some 40 Sempoalan warrior chiefs and at least 200 other natives who were tasked with dragging the cannon and carrying supplies. The combined Spanish native band soon arrived in Tlascalan, which was a confederacy of about 200 towns and different tribes very close to the imperial capital, though still independent, at least nominally. Member tribes of this confederacy, first the Otomi and then the Tlascalans, initially fought the Spanish in a series of 3 battles between the 2nd and 5th of September 1519. But after Cortez continued to release prisoners from these battles with messages of peace, and realizing the Spanish were enemies of Moctezuma, prominent members of the Confederacy managed to persuade the Tlascalan warlord, Xicotencatl the Younger, that it would be better to ally with the newcomers than to kill them. I think it's important to not understate the degree of hatred that existed between these combined tribes and the Aztecs, so we can understand why they ultimately made this decision to ally with the Spanish that will prove to be so important later on. You see, before the Spanish had arrived in the region, the Aztecs had been waging a yearly, almost century-long series of conflicts against the Tlascalans and their allies known as the Flower Wars, without ever fully conquering the area, despite the fact the Aztecs had it completely surrounded and were the much stronger of the two. If this seems strange to you, as to why the Aztecs wouldn't just fully conquer the area then, as they had with so many others, it is believed their motives for doing this was so that they could have a constant supply of war captives to sacrifice to their gods. This, combined with the fact that the Aztecs blocked trade to the region, predictably contributed to the area also being very poor and lacking many things their fellow indigenous peoples enjoyed. So with all this in mind, it really shouldn't be that surprising that when Cortez and his men arrived in Tlaxcala on the 23rd of September 1519, following their few battles earlier in the month, they were greeted with joy by the rulers who relished the opportunity to just maybe get back at the Aztecs with the assistance of advanced European technology and military tactics. During their what would be 20-day stay in Tlaxcala, to allow their men time to recover from their wounds, the Spaniards actually showed a great deal of respect to the natives, agreeing to respect parts of the city like the temples, and only taking things that were offered to them freely. As with the previous native groups, it should come as no real surprise that during this stay, Cortez also preached to the Tlascalan leaders about the benefits of Christianity, with legends saying that he actually managed to convince the 4 leaders of the Confederation to be baptized, receiving the Christian names of Don Lorenzo, Don Vicente, Don Barolome, and Don Gonzalo. If this little fact actually is true, it is impossible to tell whether or not these leaders truly understood the Catholic faith, given the complicated system of translation previously mentioned, but either way, they probably had no problem simply adding the Christian god to their already long and complex pantheon. While Cortez was cozying up with his new friends, Moctezuma's ambassadors, who were actually still present, having been in the Spanish camp after the initial battles with the Tlascalans, attempted to convince Cortez to take the road to the capital via the second largest city of the Mesoamerican world, Cholula, which was under Aztec control, instead of Huizo-Zinco, which was an ally of Tlaxcala. The ambassadors were also said to be surprised that Cortez had stayed in Tlaxcala for so long, among those who they considered a poor and ill-bred people. Weighing up his options, it seems that Cortez perceived the large city of Cholula, which was also a center of and one of the most prestigious places of the Aztec religion, owing to its huge pyramid that was actually larger in volume than the Great Pyramids of Egypt, as more of a military threat to his rearguard than a religious center, and thus he decided to send emissaries ahead to try secure a peaceful entrance into the city. At this time, it appears that Cortez was somewhat playing both sides as well, as not yet fully deciding to start a war with the Aztec Empire, he accepted the gifts of the Aztec ambassadors, while at the same time accepting the offer of the Tlaxcalan allies to provide porters and 1,000 warriors on his march to Cholula that would soon be underway, having eventually decided on it instead of Huizo-Zinco. It would be at Cholula that one of the most controversial and unclear events of the entire expedition occurred, when following their entrance into the city without active resistance, the Spanish were not met by the city leaders and not even given any food or drink on the 3rd day. Tensions further escalated when, according to Sempoalan reports, fortifications were being constructed around the city, and the suspicious Tlascalans, enemies of the Cholula, began warning the Spanish of their possible intentions. According to Spanish accounts, the final straw came not long after, when the previously mentioned La Malinche, or Don Marina, informed Cortez, after having spoken with the wife of one of the lords of Cholula, that the locals planned to murder the Spanish in their sleep. Even though Cortez was not sure whether this rumor was true or not, with the enthusiastic support of the Tlascalans, he ordered a preemptive strike where Cortez confronted the city leaders in the main temple, accusing them of planning to attack his men, with the leaders subsequently admitting they had been ordered to resist by Moctezuma, but claimed to have not followed his orders. Perhaps unconvinced, or simply not wanting to risk it, Cortez then ordered his men to seize and kill many of the local nobles to serve as a lesson, which eventually progressed into an all-out massacre, leaving around 6,000 people dead in less than 2 hours. Incredibly, the massacre could have actually been far worse, but fortunately most of the women and children, and many men as well, had already fled the city prior to this point. Now, what I just told you was primarily the Spanish account of what happened, and I think it's worth mentioning both the Aztec and the Tlaxcalteca histories, which tell a somewhat different story of the events, with the Tlascalans claiming that their ambassador who was sent to Cholula had actually been tortured by the Cholula, and thus Cortez was avenging him by attacking them, while the Aztecs on the other hand, in their accounts, mostly put the blame on Tlaxcalteca, claiming that they resented Cortez going to Cholula instead of their own city, and as a result manipulated Cortez into sanctioning the attack. Regardless of what exactly happened that day, the massacre had a chilling effect on the other city-states and groups affiliated with the Aztecs, as well as the Aztecs themselves, with tales of the massacre seemingly convincing many other cities in the empire to seriously entertain Cortez's proposals rather than risk the same fate. Despite the great loss of life that had occurred, it seems Cortez himself was still not yet fully decided on war with the Aztecs, as following the massacre, he sent emissaries to Moctezuma with the message that the people of Cholula had treated him with trickery and had therefore been punished. With Moctezuma, according to Spanish sources, then blaming the commanders of the local Aztec garrison for the resistance in Cholula, and realizing his long-standing attempts to dissuade Cortez from coming to Tenochtitlan had failed and that nothing else could be done, finally officially invited the conquistadors to visit his capital city. The Spaniards eventually arrived in the mystical capital, which was actually one of the largest cities in the entire world at the time, on the 8th of November 1519, and was soon greeted by Moctezuma, who was accompanied by many of his most important chiefs, as well as his brother and nephew. It seems even at this first meeting, cultural tension and differences quickly became apparent, as when Moctezuma went to greet Cortez personally, alongside his aforementioned brother and nephew, Cortez strode ahead of his commanders and attempted to embrace Moctezuma, but was quickly restrained as neither Cortez nor anyone else was permitted to touch the emperor in the Aztec culture. Fortunately for Cortez, this confusion didn't escalate into anything worse, as Moctezuma then personally dressed Cortez in a priceless traditional Aztec outfit before bringing him to the shrine of the goddess of Tosi, where the two men could discuss the situation privately, but not before publicly greeting him, supposedly saying, "My lord, you have become fatigued, you have become tired. To the land you have arrived. You have come to your city, Mexico. Here you have come to sit on your place, on your throne. Oh, it has been reserved to you for a small time. It was conserved by those who have gone, your substitutes. This is what has been told by our rulers, those whom governed this city, ruled this city, that you would come to ask for your throne, your place, that you would come here. Come to the land, come and rest, take possession of your royal houses, give food to your body." After this greeting, it is believed that in the following more private meeting, Moctezuma practically gave the Aztec Empire to Cortez and declared his desire to serve, even going as far as to have the royal palace prepared for Cortez. Before we go any further though, an important thing that has to be pointed out with all these things Moctezuma supposedly said is that it was tradition for Aztec rulers to speak in overly polite language and expressions, so how much of this he really meant literally or even said at all, if you understandably don't find the Spanish 100% trustable in these circumstances, is unclear. With that in mind, later on the same day, it is said that Moctezuma came again to visit Cortez and his men, with Spanish accounts recalling that he first repeated his earlier welcome to Cortez, and then went on to explain his view of what the Spanish expedition represented in terms of Aztec tradition and law, including his idea that Cortez and his men were the return of characters from Aztec legend. After which, he pledged his loyalty to the King of Spain and accepted Cortez as the king's representative. Unfortunately, things wouldn't go this smooth forever though, as following Cortez's request to allow him to erect a cross and an image of the Virgin Mary next to large idols of two Aztec gods at the top of the main temple pyramid, Moctezuma and his men became enraged at the suggestion, with the emperor claiming that his idols give us health and rain and crops and weather, and all the victories we desire. Tensions further escalated soon after this dispute when the massacre killed 7 Spanish soldiers Cortez had left on the coast, as well as a few Totonacs. According to Spanish accounts, it was this act that compelled Cortez to take his most drastic and aggressive action yet, as he then, along with his 5 captains, Dona Marina and our old friend Aguilar, convinced Moctezuma to "Come quietly with us to our quarters and make no protest. If you cry out or raise any commotion, you will immediately be killed," essentially reducing the emperor to a prisoner of the Spanish, a status he seemingly begrudgingly accepted out of fears of a rebellion in the city, or that the Spanish might try set up another prince in his place, with this being in spite of Moctezuma's chieftains, nephew and other relatives, counseling that they should instead attack the Spanish. Just when it seemed tensions in the capital couldn't get any worse, according to the Mexican papas, or priests, the Aztec gods told them that they would not stay unless the Spaniards were killed and driven back across the sea, further enraging the locals, with many of the nobility at this point beginning to rally around the emperor's younger brother and heir apparent, Cuitlahuac, though most were still unwilling to take any drastic actions against the Spanish without their emperor's command. It was against this backdrop of tension and mistrust in the capital that in April 1520, Cortez was given the dire news by Moctezuma that a much larger party of Spanish troops had arrived, consisting of 19 ships and 1,400 soldiers under the command of Panfilo de Narvaez, who had been sent by Governor Velasquez from Cuba with orders to kill or capture Cortez for going beyond the terms of his expedition and blatantly disregarding Velasquez's orders. Realizing the threat this party posed, Cortez left Tenochtitlan and Moctezuma in the hands of his least reliable soldiers under the command of his trusted officer Pedro de Alvarado, and made his way towards Zempoala, where he surprised Narvaez's forces with a combined Spanish-native night attack, during which Narvaez was seriously wounded in the eye by a pike and taken prisoner, quickly ending the battle in a decisive victory for Cortez. After the battle, if you can even call it that, was over, Cortez then managed to convince Narvaez's surviving men to join his side by both allowing them to settle in the country and promising to make them rich and give them rewards, greatly reinforcing his Spanish army, reinforcements that would soon prove to be of great importance. At the head of a now 1,300-strong force, Cortez returned to Tenochtitlan in June 1520, only to find that in his absence, to put it bluntly, all hell had broken loose, due to Alvarado and his men attacking and killing many of the Aztec nobility in an event known as the Massacre in the Great Temple, during a religious festival organized by the Aztecs, with Alvarado's later explanation to Cortez being that they had learned that the Aztecs planned to attack the Spanish garrison in the city once the festival was complete, so he had launched a preemptive attack. Whether that was true or not, following the Spanish attack, the city, surprisingly to the Spanish, rose en masse against them, and fierce fighting ensued, with Aztec troops besieging the palace housing the Spaniards and Moctezuma. By the time Cortez returned, the Aztecs had already ousted Moctezuma from his position and named his brother, the aforementioned Cuitlahuac, as the new emperor. Seemingly unaware of this fact, upon his arrival, Cortez ordered Moctezuma to address his people from a terrace in order to persuade them to stop fighting and allow the Spaniards to leave the city in peace. However, the furious crowd jeered their previous ruler and pelted him with stones and darts, according to Spanish accounts, killing him in the process, though the Aztecs in contrast claim he was actually killed by the Spanish. Either way, with Moctezuma dead, Cortez and Alvarado realized how dire of a situation they found themselves in and decided to break out of the city under the cover of darkness. This breakout would come soon after, when on a rainy night in early July, the Spanish, carrying as much treasure as realistically possible, left their compound and headed west towards the Tlacopan causeway. The Spaniards miraculously initially managed to leave their compound unnoticed. However, before reaching the causeway, they were seen by elite Aztec soldiers known as the Eagle Warriors, who sounded the alarm. As news of the breakout spread among the natives, numerous Aztec warriors, noblemen, and commoners alike emerged from their houses and began attacking the Spaniards from every direction in what soon divulged into ferocious fighting. As the Spaniards and their native allies fought their way to the causeway, hundreds of canoes then appeared in the waters that surrounded the Lake Island city and began to harry them from yet another direction, but with no other option, they had to press on. The fighting was so horrific and intense that some Spanish soldiers, weighed down by gold and equipment, lost their footing, fell into the lake and drowned. At some point during this frenzy, Cortez, amid a vanguard of horsemen, pressed ahead and reached dry land at Tacuba, leaving the rest of the expedition to fend for itself in the treacherous crossing. A conquistador present at the time, Bernal Diaz del Castillo, who a lot of the information in this video comes from, later defended this action, stating that trying to stay and fight for the rest would have likely ended with them all being wiped out. A bit later on, seeing the wounded survivors straggle into the village, Cortez and his horsemen turned back to the causeway where they encountered Pedro de Alvarado, unhorsed and badly wounded, in the company of a handful of Spaniards and Tlascaltecs who had escaped the slaughter. According to Diaz, it was at this point that tears came to Cortez's eyes as he realized the extent of the slaughter, with the supposed location of this tragic moment, known as the Old Tree, still being a monument in Mexico City today. The exact number of men killed in this disastrous escape from the capital is unclear, though Cortez himself put the number at about 154 Spaniards and over 2,000 native allies, while Diaz put it at around 450 Spaniards and 1,000 allies. Additionally, the Spanish also lost all of their artillery and most of their horses during the night that became known as La Noche Triste, or the Night of Sorrows. Despite its name, there wouldn't be much time for mourning or sorrow on the actual night, as following their arrival in the village, Cortez and his men were quickly pursued by the Aztecs, but thanks to the help and guidance of their Tlascalan allies, the joint force managed to move around Lake Zumpango and towards a sanctuary in Tlaxcala. Before they could reach this safe haven, however, they were met by a large Aztec force in the Battle of Otumba, where despite being outnumbered, exhausted, and starving, the Spanish and Tlascalans managed to hold out against the Aztecs, who it is believed already regarded the Spaniards as defeated and were looking to gain glory from capturing live Spaniards to sacrifice to their gods. This notion would have been quickly broken though when the Spanish cavalry launched continuous attacks against these stunned Aztec lines, who despite their long contact with the Spaniards had never actually met them in combat until this point. The impressive victory was also largely thanks to Cortez's strategy of targeting the Aztecs' captains and leaders, with Cortez himself personally leading a cavalry charge against the Aztec commander, Matlazincatl, who was subsequently slain by one of Cortez's men, Juan de Salamanca, who retrieved the Aztec battle standard and delivered it to Cortez. Following their commander's death, it is believed that the Aztec force gradually diminished and the Tlascalan and Spanish warriors managed to rout them. After this bloody battle, the wounded joint army were finally able to complete their escape to Tlaxcala, where they were told by the Tlascalan leaders to consider yourselves at home, rest, do not think it a small thing that you have escaped with your lives from that strong city. If we thought of you as brave men before, we consider you much braver now. Cortez and his men spent the next couple of months slowly regaining their strength in Tlaxcala, while at the same time turning more and more indigenous tribes over to their side against the brutal regime of the Aztecs. During this time of relative peace, over in Tenochtitlan, the Aztec Empire had been struck with a catastrophic smallpox plague, unknowingly introduced by the Spanish, which started in September 1520, lasting about 70 days and killing almost half of Tenochtitlan's population, including the Emperor Cuauhtémoc, who was soon succeeded by his cousin Cuauhtémoc. I would be remiss not to mention that the presence of smallpox did also have an impact on the Spanish themselves and their leadership, although not nearly to the same catastrophic degree, as the Spanish had a high natural resistance to the disease when compared to the indigenous peoples who had none. I think the most clear sign of this is the difference in the fatality rate of the disease, with smallpox during this period killing around 20 to 30% of infected Europeans, whereas in indigenous populations this number was often well over 50% and could even reach as high as 90% in some groups. Bearing this in mind, with the Aztec Empire in a state of disarray, the joint Tlascalan and Spanish forces eventually left their safe haven once more in December 1520 and went about systemically conquering and subjugating, either through violence or diplomacy, all the nearby towns still under Aztec control, until just Tenochtitlan and the neighbouring city of Tlatelolco remained unconquered or not allied with the Spaniards. Cortez and his indigenous allies finally reached the outskirts of the Aztec capital itself in May 1521 after numerous battles against Cuauhtémoc's forces, soon beginning a siege of the city. By the time of this siege, Cortez's forces are believed to have numbered more than 800 Spanish conquistadors and tens of thousands of indigenous warriors, who soon went about surrounding the city and cutting off its food and water supply. The first major assault of the siege would come about a month after their arrival on the 20th of June 1521, when Cortez, likely due to growing dissatisfaction among his men due to the lack of progress that had been made, decided to launch a massive assault against the city in order to take the market town of Tlatelolco in what became known as the Battle of Colhuacatonco. This battle began with Cortez and his men rapidly making their way towards the market with the help of a light cannon, early guns known as arquebusiers, crossbowmen, and their thousands of native warriors who fought the Aztecs fiercely. As they grew closer to the market itself, either overconfident or perhaps suspicious of the oddly quick advance, Cortez began to halt the push and slow down. A decision which ultimately proved to have disastrous consequences, as hundreds of Aztec warriors who had hidden within the surrounding buildings saw their chance to strike and ambush the unprepared Spanish native allies. Cortez at first tried to encourage his soldiers to fight back, however he soon recognized the gravity of the situation and understood the battle was already lost, ordering a retreat. During the chaotic situation that ensued, Cortez himself was actually injured in the leg and captured by 7 Mexico warriors, but was saved by 2 Spaniards, Cristobal de Olea and Cristobal de Guzman, who ultimately gave their lives for Cortez, as well as a Tlascalan officer. By the time the battle was said and done, the Spaniards had suffered their worst losses since their earlier retreat from the capital, among them being 65 Spanish soldiers who were unfortunate enough to be captured alive and were either killed outright or more brutally sacrificed to the Aztec gods in full view of their fellow Spaniards outside the city who watched on in horror, with Diaz later recounting, "The dismal drum of Huichilobos sounded again. We saw our comrades, who had been captured in Cortez's defeat, being dragged up the steps to be sacrificed. Cutting open their chests, drew out their palpitating hearts, which they offered to the idols. The Indian butchers cut off their arms and legs, then they ate their flesh with a sauce of peppers and tomatoes, throwing their trunk and entrails to the lions and tigers and serpents and snakes." The Aztecs also supposedly sent the cooked limbs of their prisoners to the Tlascalans at this point, supposedly shouting, "Eat the flesh of these tuales," meaning gods, in reference to the early belief that the Spanish were supernatural, "and of your brothers because we are sated with it." Following the disastrous defeat that was the Battle of Colhuacatonco, the Spanish resolved to simply starve the Aztecs out, and over the course of the next few months, progressively tightened their grip on the capital as the Aztecs weakened day by day while the Spanish and their native allies only grew stronger and stronger, receiving large amounts of supplies from Veracruz during this period. The fateful day of the final battle for the city finally came on the 13th of August 1521. When Cortez decided the time was right to order the simultaneous advance of all 3 camps that had been surrounding the city towards the Tlatelolco marketplace once again. Though the Aztecs inflicted heavy casualties on the attackers, this time they were not strong enough to halt the Spanish advance. While the fighting raged beneath them, it is believed that the Aztecs cut out and ate the hearts of 70 more Spanish prisoners of war at an altar to one of their gods, infuriating the Spanish and likely contributing to the massacre that soon unfolded. Although Cortez later claimed it was mostly the Tlascalans responsible for the great slaughter in the city during and after the battle, the reality is that atrocities were almost certainly committed by both the Spanish and their native allies, as they ruthlessly subdued the Aztecs street by street. In addition to the great loss of lives, houses were burned and temples were destroyed en masse, while the attackers looted what they could. By the end of the day, the city lay in ruins, and Cortez declared the city conquered, ultimately leaving some 450 to 860 Spaniards, 20,000 Tlascalans, and maybe as many as 100,000 Aztecs killed in action by the time it was said and done, on top of at least 40,000 Aztec civilians who were also killed in the merciless slaughter that followed. As for the Aztec emperor, he attempted to escape during the carnage with some of his loyal advisors and nobles, but was discovered and captured, later being hanged. The fall of Tenochtitlan ultimately marked the fall of the Aztec Empire and the beginning of Spain's complete conquest of the rest of both Meso and what became South America over the course of the next few decades. That, however, is a story for another day, so I think I'm going to end the video there. This was certainly a long one, so if you made it this far, you're an absolute legend, and if you enjoyed, please don't forget to leave a like and subscribe if you'd like to see more content from me. With all that being said though, thank you so much for watching, and I hope you all have a great day, night, wherever you are, and I hope to see you in the next one.